What's up guys, and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be talking about shoulders and how you can build big juicy Cannonball 3D delts. Common misconception that I need to clear up is that you can actually build the majority of your shoulder muscles just from doing very heavy pressing and rowing. So pressing basics. A lot of people, when they think of shoulder pressing, they'll think, okay, dumbbell shoulder press, okay? That is a good exercise, don't get me wrong, but they will get to a point, which I got to a while ago, where it becomes increasingly difficult to lift heavier and heavier. Why is that? First of all, just getting the weight into position becomes more of a task in itself, and you run the risk of injuring yourself. For example, whenever I'm lifting more than 40 kilograms, right, just getting it into position like this, and then up, and then up, and like that, okay? That not only takes a hell of a lot of effort in itself, but I've actually injured myself a couple of times just getting into that initial position. On top of that, you end up spending the majority of your concentration and effort in just stabilizing the movement. So that becomes problematic. Instead, once you have progressed and you're looking to continue to progress, I recommend doing overhead pressing where the resistance itself is fixed. It can only go in one direction. For example, a seated overhead machine press, whether it's hands wide, hands close, or seated Smith machine press. The majority of my overhead pressing now comes from just doing Smith machine because it's stable and I can continue to load it up heavier and heavier. I tend to avoid machines like this just because it feels pretty uncomfortable at the bottom of the movement where I'm forced to internally rotate. I think a lot of people who do this will notice they get shoulder pain. If that's the case, stop doing it. I like to do the machines where it's more of a neutral grip. My elbows are pointing forward and it just feels a lot more natural. You can also argue as well the range of motion is a little bit better as you can go deeper into the movement without any kind of discomfort. So you master the overhead pressing, you pick good exercises, you get strong, you're gonna get your front and mid delts covered. In terms of the rear delts, again, you can get them covered if you do a lot of heavy rowing. For example, any kind of chest supported row machine, for example this T-bar row, keeping the elbows high, driving back will stimulate a lot of your upper back, traps, but also rear delts. Another prime example of a row that will also hit your rear delts really good, any kind of chest supported incline row, keeping the elbows a little bit more narrow, like this. Driving high, elbows up, pinching the rear delts. So I wouldn't class that as pure rear delt isolation. Of course, you're gonna get some back stimulation, but doing those types of rows is gonna help to build the rear delts. I'm gonna talk about how you should program in these exercises later on in the video, but once you have prioritized the overhead pressing, the rowing, then you can start to sprinkle in some complementary delt isolation exercises into your routine. First, we'll talk about some lateral raise variations, okay? So exercises that will focus on building up the mid delt. So I have probably 4 to 5 favorite exercises for mid delt training. Now, I do not do these all at the same time in 1 week of programming. It's usually the case that I'll rotate these exercises with each program phase which I'm doing. First one would be some sort of dumbbell lateral raise, like this, for example. Anybody can do this as long as you have dumbbells. Having a bench helps to just stabilize your torso a little bit and lean forward so you can keep the tension on the mid delt. The seated lateral raise machine is also a very good exercise to choose. The same goes for a standing lateral raise machine. Both allow you to have that constant tension throughout the lengthened, mid, and shortened position. And then on top of that, we have either a lying cable lateral raise or a Y raise. This one, extremely effective, but it's just a little bit more of a ball ache to set up because you gotta have a bench, you gotta have the cables in the right position, and you gotta have the cuffs. The cuffs will basically allow your hands to relax and place more of the tension onto your delt, so I do highly recommend using these. And then rear delt focused exercises, I probably have 2 or 3 of my favorites which I will rotate through. Basically anything that's going through this type of movement, whether it's both arms at the same time or single arm, very good. A reverse cable fly with the cuffs again, just so you can place all the tension on your rear delt. And then we have two variations of a dumbbell rear delt fly. There's either one which I'll do straight armed, keeping my shoulders pushed forward, going through a very fixed range of motion with my elbows coming out directly to the side. Or I'll go through a full range of motion whereby I'm driving my elbows back and pinching more at the top of the movement. And then we have reverse pec deck, a classic staple for building the rear delts. You can do both at the same time, or one arm at a time. Up to you. I find this one pretty awkward, to be honest. Greater range of motion, yes. More awkward to stabilize yourself, yes. But both can be effective if done properly. When it comes to rep ranges, there's many different opinions out there. I've tried going 6 reps all the way up to 15 reps. In fact, back in the day, whenever I was doing isolation exercises for mid delts, front delts or rear delts, I used to think, oh, more was better, and I would go higher reps. But obviously when you go higher reps, it reduces the overall load which you can lift. And realistically, I think it's safe to say that muscles will grow when you increase the load. You place more mechanical tension on the working muscle. So in order to do that, you're gonna have to reduce the rep ranges a little bit. So anywhere from 6 reps up to 10 is a good benchmark to be in. There's other people who have studied this their entire life who would say, well, 5 reps up to 15 reps is also going to be beneficial for stimulating growth. It's really hard to say, okay? People will just have different opinions on this. But I would always say to try and focus on lifting as heavy as possible. And the more reps you do, the harder this becomes, okay? Now, you probably noticed that I have not mentioned anything about direct front delt training. Now, why is that? Are you saying that all front delt focused exercises are bad? Doing front raises and things like that? They're not bad, they're certainly good. But you'll notice that most people, when you look at their shoulder from the side, their front delts are more developed than the mid and rear delts. So why would you focus doing more isolation exercises to grow the section of the muscle which is stronger and bigger than the rest? You will get enough front delt stimulation from doing heavy overhead pressing and heavy bench pressing and flies. It's very difficult to completely take out your front delt. And most people, because their form isn't that good, whenever they're doing their chest training, they'll often find that a lot of their front delt is doing the majority of the work. So it's even going to be more of the case that they should not be doing any front delt training. The only time I would do direct front delt training is if for some weird ass reason you had a really undeveloped front delt. But that generally doesn't tend to be the case. Right then, I've given you a lot of exercises to think about, and you're probably overwhelmed with which one you should friggin' do and how you should structure it. Well, let's try and break it down logically and sensibly, okay? I'm going to show you 2 examples for those people who are following a 5-day split or a 4-day split. This is a 5-day split, okay? Probably one of the best 5-day splits of all time is the push-pull legs upper lower in terms of building the proportionate physique and training everything equally. Ideally, what we want to be doing when it comes to building and maximizing the growth of any muscle group is training it at least 2 to 3 times per week. At least 2. 3 is also great. More than that, not necessarily. Less than that, not going to be enough. Okay? So how would I program it? Let's say, for example, we got the push-pull legs upper lower. Push-pull legs upper lower. So push day. We would focus on doing the very heavy overhead pressing. And we would also focus on doing the lateral raise variation. Now that will be enough, okay? What most people make the mistake of, and I've noticed myself whenever I've programmed my push days, if you're doing 2 very heavy pressing movements, for example, overhead press, chest press, whichever one you do second is going to be less effective because you are fatigued from the first heavy overhead press that you have done, okay? So this day, focus on the overhead pressing. Don't do any chest pressing. The chest exercise you want to be focusing on doing is some sort of a chest fly, okay? Pec deck, cables, dumbbells, okay? And then we've got a lateral raise variation, which you can decide to do whether it's the machine, whether it's a cable, whether it's a dumbbell. That's the push day sorted. Pull day, okay? You're going to do your heavy row, right? Whether it's a heavy row, elbows flared or tucked in. That's obviously going to be working your upper back, but also rear delts. And you have a rear delt focused fly, which you will be doing. that's your 2 exercises covered. You will do 2 to 3 sets. I would recommend doing 2 very heavy sets for the big compound lift, and then maybe 2 to 3 sets of the isolation work. Day 3 is obviously legs, nothing. Day 4, I'd recommend having a rest day. When we're going to the upper, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, okay? So you have a choice. Are you also looking to focus on maximizing growth in your chest? In which case, I would probably get rid of the overhead press and do the first heavy chest or press movement being chest, okay? If that makes sense. Sorry, I worded that stupidly. And then I would do the rear delt fly, and I would do the heavy row. I wouldn't necessarily need to do the lateral raise variation because I focused on hitting the mid delts by doing the overhead press. I would probably follow this approach if I was happy with my chest development. Okay, I would go through a period of time for a couple of weeks where I pull back on the amount of volume I do in my chest and focus on just building up my shoulders, because realistically, that is the goal. Now, if I also had a pretty shitty chest that I wasn't happy with, then instead of doing the overhead press again, I would cut this out and instead do the lateral raise variation. And instead of the overhead press, I'll be doing a heavy chest press. If you were to go back and just focus on doing the overhead pressing, you could do the same exercise, but I would recommend doing an overhead press like this, for example, in the Smith machine, and then I would do an overhead press in this position, okay, where it's more of a neutral grip, purely just to keep your joints happy. I've noticed when I've done an excessive amount of pressing in this position with the elbows flared, my shoulders the joints themselves start to get a little bit uncomfortable. I feel pain. And I've noticed this when I've tried to do too much heavy pressing in one session. Now, let's have a look at if you are going to do 4 sessions per week. Right then, here we go, 4-day split. You could do upper, lower, but we're focusing on getting our delts jacked. So I'd recommend doing upper, lower, upper, full body. That way you can hit legs twice a week and you can get that extra delt work. Now, this is how I would do it. Day 1, this is upper body. I would do the heavy overhead press. No need to do the lateral raise in this situation. You do the heavy row and then you do the rear delt fly. Day 2 is obviously legs. I'm not doing any upper body. Day 3, I recommend having a rest day. Day 4, upper body again. So I'd do heavy row again. I'll do the lateral raise and I'd do the rear delt fly again. Maybe that's not going to be necessary this time around, but I probably would recommend doing that if the focus is to grow the shoulders. Day 5, obviously, we'll do a rest day again. Day 6, this could be lower, but we're not doing lower, we're doing full body. So in this full body session, we're going to do lateral raise again, and we'll do heavy overhead press. Of course, if you were trying to focus on growing your chest, then the priority would be doing the heavy chest press. And maybe in this session, you would just do the lateral raise. But my recommendation would be to focus on doing the overhead press, the variation from this overhead press, different exercise, and then focus on doing a chest fly instead. You could do another chest press if you wanted to, but just understand, as I mentioned before, your performance in the chest press isn't going to be as good if you've already maxed out on the heavy overhead press, okay? So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. This is a optimal way of programming and not overdoing it. Most people would think, oh, well, you know, I'm just going to do shitloads of shoulder exercises, or I'm going to do a full day dedicated to shoulders. I know lots of people who do that. For example, Ryan Terry, he still programs in a full day dedicated to shoulders, but he is on the absolute upper limits of being a Mr. Olympia competitor. For most people looking to build good shoulders, that's just unnecessary. Hey, after you've done 2 to 3 exercises focusing on growing your shoulders, anything after that tends to be overkill, overtraining, and just not actually adding that much in terms of additional growth. Usually just means that you're going to then need more time to recover after doing that session, and then you run the risk of buggering up your joints from doing too much pressing, okay? So there we have it, guys. A little bit of wisdom shared to you on how to grow your shoulders. Hopefully that makes sense, how you should program it, which exercises you should choose. But as always, the focus should be mastering the execution of the exercises and lifting as heavy as possible. Don't stress too much about the finer details. As I mentioned at the start of the video, if you can just get really strong at overhead pressing and rowing, you've already done the majority of the work. Anything after that is just that fine detailing. If you actually want to see some results when you go to the gym and don't want to stress about, oh, which exercises should I do, how should I program, how many sets, reps, etc. should I be doing, all the hard work is taken care of, and it's inside of the Thirst app.